Hello, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. We're just waiting for all of our attendees to arrive, and we'll be starting in just a few minutes. Good afternoon, and thanks very much for joining us. My name is Denise Fignon. I want to welcome you to Howard Center's Marna and Stephen Wise Tulin Community Education Series. Such a beautiful, beautiful Vermont afternoon, so appreciate you being inside with us. Today's session on support approaches to hoarding and clutter is the final of 3 sessions this spring, and we're so pleased to have Erin Roelke and Millie Richard from AgeWell with us. I'll be introducing them in just a few minutes. I want to let you know that our 2 previous spring sessions, Dr. John Brookland's presentation on alcohol use and Maureen McGuff's session on policing, community relationships, and public health, are both available online at howardcenter.org in our community education area. We'll have today's session recorded and posted there within a day or 2. Now we'd like to extend our thanks to our partner and our friends at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont for their support for our spring series. Their ongoing help and support to all of us at Howard Center is greatly appreciated. Turning to today's format, we're planning about an hour of presentation followed by Q&A. After Erin and Millie make their remarks, they will take questions which may be sent through the Q&A at any time throughout the session. You'll find the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen or on your Zoom toolbar. I'm sure you know where it is. It's fine to submit your questions anonymously if you'd prefer. During today's webinar, your audio, video, and chat functions will not be available. Also, the hand raise function will not be monitored. So let's go ahead and get started. We have a few hundred folks who have registered for today. Let's see how many actually attend with this beautiful sunny Vermont day. But obviously there's a great deal of interest in this topic, and we're really looking forward to hearing from Erin and Millie in just a few minutes. So it's my pleasure to introduce Erin Roelke. Erin has been working with individuals with hoarding disorder and excessive clutter for over 5 years, both individually and through facilitation of an evidence-based peer support workshop called Buried in Treasures. She's passionate about helping individuals reach their goals while maintaining independence and autonomy. Erin serves as the Director of Care and Service Coordination at AgeWell, where she oversees programming that can provide support to individuals facing challenges with hoarding and clutter. And it's also our pleasure to welcome Millie Richard. Millie facilitates the evidence-based Buried in Treasures workshop for AgeWell and is a volunteer peer advocate on the Chittenden County Hoarding Task Force. By sharing stories from her own lived experience with hoarding and squalor, she works to put a human face on clutter-related issues in our community. With over 9 years experience with peer support, she has heard many stories. And Millie says you can ask her questions you'd be too polite to ask your neighbors. That's an invitation. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Erin Roelke and Millie Richard.
Thank you so much, Denise, for that great introduction. Millie and I are really happy to be here today and talk a little bit more about hoarding and some of the resources that are available in our community here. I'm just going to go ahead and share. Here we go. All right. So before we get started, I just want to share a little bit about AgeWell. So AgeWell is an area agency on aging that serves Chittenden, Franklin, Addison, and Grand Isle counties. We work with anyone over 60, along with family caregivers and other individuals who may either be under 60 with a disability or a caregiver or support of somebody who's over 60. Our mission is to provide the support and guidance that inspires our community to embrace aging with confidence. So we're going to jump right in here and just talk about what the DSM-5 definition of hoarding disorder is. And I'll give the caveat here that neither Millie or I are clinicians, so we are never in the position of diagnosing someone with hoarding disorder. But it is, I think, very important to understand what this definition is. And historically, that the DSM-5 is the first time that hoarding disorder has been listed as its own disorder. In previous editions, it was a subcategory of obsessive compulsive disorder. So just looking at the disorder here, the first criteria is a persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions regardless of their actual value. It needs to be due to a perceived need to save the items and distress associated with discarding them. The symptoms must result in the accumulation of possessions that congest and clutter active living areas and compromise their intended use. If living areas are uncluttered, it may be because of interventions for third parties. I'd probably add an additional caveat there that there may be homes where some areas are uncluttered and others have significantly more cluttering. We'll talk about that a little bit further on. Section D here is the hoarding causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, including maintaining a safe environment for self and others. And E and F really state that the hoarding cannot be due to another medical or mental health condition. And that's particularly important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. It does have big implications for how you might approach providing support to somebody who has a lot of clutter in their homes. And I also just want to emphasize that we're starting with talking about the definition of hoarding disorder, but what Millie and I are going to talk about is really much broader than that. Someone definitely does not need to have a diagnosis of hoarding disorder in order for any of these types of interventions to be appropriate. It's also possible that someone really doesn't meet the criteria for hoarding disorder, but still has problems with clutter that are impacting their living spaces and really might benefit or be seeking out support. There are a couple of specifiers in the DSM-5 associated with the hoarding disorder diagnosis, and we wanted to make sure that we included these because they are, again, really important for thinking about what types of supports may be provided. So one of the specifiers is that hoarding disorder can be coupled with or without excessive acquisition, which I think is something that most people tend to miss. Just because someone has a large volume of possessions doesn't mean that they are actively acquiring at this time. There could have been former periods of excessive acquiring, or acquiring could have taken place really more gradually over a lifetime to result in a large volume of belongings. Often it just means that the level of acquiring is not matched with the level of discarding. And then different levels of insight, which is really important for anyone working with someone with excessive clutter to assess. So how aware are they of some of the issues that you as a provider or as a family member or a neighbor may be seeing? And really how much insight there is also going to impact what types of supports might be most helpful for this person. Millie, I'm going to hand it over to you for this one.
Yeah, let me jump in here on Squalor. So hoarding is an uncomfortable enough word for a lot of folks who have clutter issues to wrap their heads around. Squalor takes it to a whole other level. But Squalor is actually my introduction to peer support. So Squalor is a state of living that is just mess. It's uncleanliness. It may include bugs and waste and trash and food and all sorts of things that may or may not also include clutter. So squalor shows up a lot as a symptom of depression, for example, or a host of other problems. But squalor and hoarding are separate things that can occur together. One person from a peer support group that I'm involved in described squalor as the result of countless small acts of self-neglect. And that's kind of how we discuss it in those peer support circles, where we'll talk about the squalor in our home, or body squalor, or even financial squalor, just an inability to manage what's going on in your life that results in sort of a filth, if you will, that is definitely hard for people to stomach. And often when folks are introducing themselves to me, the first thing they say is, "I'm not like those people on TV." And what they're usually referencing is a squalor situation that they've seen.
Thanks, Millie. And I think a lot of what Millie and I are going to talk about today is sort of judgment that can be imbued behind some of these definitions. This was one where we actually searched through quite a number of definitions, and we ended up doing some wordsmithing ourselves and probably still aren't fully comfortable with this definition. But it is really important to talk about, and especially some of the differences between hoarding and squalor, even though they can happen at the same time or they can happen separately. So there's a lot of words on this slide. I'm certainly not going to read through all of them, but this is sort of a version of, there's several different types of charts like this out there. I'll say again, another caveat, just be aware of any resources as you're searching that seem to oversimplify hoarding or clutter or collecting or squalor. You know, there are a lot of nuances to each of these, and I'll go through what some of the differences are. But there is a lot of sort of flow between these things as well. So for hoarding, the type and volume of items, it might be any number of different types of items when there's hoarding taking place. There could be some themes to items. So there could be, amongst a lot of possessions, certain types of items that are often gathered or retained, versus with clutter, items may or may not have a specific theme. Usually the word clutter indicates that there is the volume or organization of items in the space have a negative impact on the use of the space, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the volume is more than the space can retain, which is more true of hoarding disorder. Collecting, items usually center around a specific theme and are typically purposefully displayed. And then with squalor, as Millie just talked about, the items in the home are things that might typically be thought of as trash, although they may or may not be. It's really impossible to assess the value of an item as a third party looking at it. But it could include food debris, human or animal waste, used paper products, and the debris on these items may attract insects or vermin, which often becomes a health issue. So again, I won't read through every piece of this, but important takeaways. I think collecting is one. I can say we receive a lot of referrals that say this person is a hoarder, and what is actually going on is a large volume of possessions that are part of a collection and may be displayed in a very unconventional way. So there might be things on the ceiling, on the walls, everywhere. But with collecting, it's really the items typically are displayed. They typically fall into a certain category or multiple categories. And really, most importantly, is that they do not affect the use of the rooms or the health and safety of the person inhabiting the rooms. Clutter, again, may look disorganized, but might not create an issue for the person living there. Hoarding generally is going to create problems with using the rooms as they're intended or using the facilities in the home. Again, we'll talk about more of those different nuances. So this is a great depiction, these are two images that we grabbed with permission from the Cape Cod Hoarding Task Force, although I'm not sure if that's the original source or if they're floating around on the internet somewhere, which is what often happens when we're looking for good examples. But these two photos are great examples of hoarding without squalor on the left-hand side, and then squalor without hoarding. So in the hoarding without squalor, and again, I say hoarding, not meaning to say that this person is necessarily clinically diagnosed with hoarding disorder, but we're seeing a very large volume of belongings. They're in high piles that might have a risk of falling over. We do see clear pathways there, but really there are no indications that there is anything that might be, unclean or causing health hazards in that picture. Versus on the right, we don't see a very large volume of possessions at all. Almost everything that is in the room is looks to be, soiled in some way, and likely is impacting health and safety and use of that bathroom as well. Millie, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. So when does clutter start to become a problem? We'll talk a little bit more about onset of hoarding disorder later, but when clutter, whether it be hoarding or some other form of disorganization or too much stuff, starts to become a problem, it's really just when it starts to impact your daily life and when it causes distress. So for somebody who's been collecting things and considers themselves a collector, or for somebody that has hoarding disorder, this might feel the same. They have a lot of stuff and it doesn't bother them until something happens. And that might be a change in their lifestyle. It might be that the piles of things have become so large that there really are only pathways to traverse. It might be when they realize that it takes them 3 times as long to make a cup of tea as it used to because they can't find everything they need. And also a kind of emotional distress around the idea of having to take care of it. So there's a couple of different things that happen when you live in too much stuff. And some of that is avoidance behaviors where you become maybe clutter blind to your piles. And when you notice them, they stress you out. The other thing that can make clutter really start to be a problem is when it really threatens the safety. So if tripping hazards are part of the home environment, or it does start to tend toward squalor and maybe has become a health concern. Often when folks are noticed as having an issue with clutter or squalor, it's because it's become an issue to the people around them. Maybe it started to leak out of the house or be noticed by the neighbors. And that feeling that someone's going to catch you, that you're going to be discovered as being someone who hoards, is a really intense problem that can cause a ton of distress. So there's kind of stages where you'd say, well, my house is messy. Probably I wouldn't want someone to come over without a few days notice, where I could kind of crisis clean and get it under control and still be comfortable with someone coming in the house. But then there are points where you wouldn't even let your friend in to use the bathroom because the clutter has become such an issue, and the idea that someone will see it is very, very distressing. So one point at which people might kind of self-refer or self-diagnose themselves as having a clutter issue is really that point where they realize that it's affected their social relationships with neighbors or friends. Maybe they don't let people in. Maybe their child wants to have a sleepover, and the idea of that is just completely impossible. So when clutter becomes a problem versus when people notice that clutter becomes a problem is a little bit of a distinction there.
So we've talked about the difference, the differing levels of volumes of possession. We wanted to include this clutter image rating scale. This is actually just one of several images on that scale, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later on. I'm going to just briefly talk about it as sort of a depiction of amount of clutter in a space. So you see the numbers progressing 1 to 9, and you kind of use the windows as reference points there. The thing that's interesting about this scale, and I think we have a kind of love-hate relationship with it, is that it's just a very unrealistic depiction of how belongings might be arranged in a home. So even in, levels 8 and 9 here, there's absolutely no sort of pattern at all. And it's giving you a very small depiction of the room. So it's hard to see what the rest of the living space may look like. The way that this tool can be helpful, though, is in thinking about when you go into a home and, or if you're living in that home, and you have a space that might have some areas that have nothing. There are clear pathways, there are available chairs to sit on, and then there might be some areas where there are piles that are getting a little higher. This tool really, in order to be used well, kind of makes you imagine if everything was knocked onto the floor in an even layer, where would it be on this scale? So this is a tool that is helpful in communicating with other professionals and also with individuals who have a lot of clutter to really both assess insight. So are we in agreement about the level of belongings in this room? And also to talk about, if you're working with another professional, to help them give a clear and really more objective picture of the level of belongings in the home. So we couldn't include this without including a much more realistic depiction. This is obviously a picture of someone's home, but there are a few key differences here. As you saw from the last pictures, those were really even levels of belongings, whereas here we see some piles of varying heights. I see clear pathways here in some areas. I see a pathway going up the stairs. The chair is sometimes what we refer to as the cockpit. It's often where somebody might be sitting, and not everybody, again, I have to give a caveat on everything, not everybody who may have hoarding disorder or problems with clutter will have a space that looks like this, but this is something that can be seen for some people. You can see that the chair is pretty immaculately clean. There's a clipboard and a pencil right on it. Everything that would be needed is kind of within arm's reach, versus when I look farther back in this picture, I'm guessing that the items in the back of the room probably aren't accessed as frequently because there isn't, as far as I can see in this picture here, a clear pathway to get to them. The other thing that's interesting to think about with this picture is you can imagine somebody living in this space functioning really well, or maybe not so well based on their level of mobility impairment. So, somebody maybe who is in their 20s and has no health issues and, is very mobile, wouldn't have any problem navigating those stairs at all. Thinking about some of the individuals that we worked with in the past who might have Parkinson's disease, this would be a very, very hazardous sort of pathway to try to navigate. And there would be a lot of strategies that we might use to just say, without tackling this whole project, can we just make it a little bit safer to move around the home? And it's really going to be dependent on, how that individual uses the home too. So it's hard to tell really anything from a picture, but at least this is a more realistic depiction. So talking a little bit about demographics, this chart is really showing the age of onset of hoarding symptoms of individuals who later were diagnosed with hoarding disorder. So you can see that the majority of individuals are showing some symptoms before age 25. However, what's really interesting is that often when people are seeking out support, or the clutter has become a problem for housing authorities or other individuals, it's not until later in life. So that's due to a number of factors. So somebody who is younger, but perhaps has a spouse that doesn't have hoarding behaviors, a lot of that environment might be supported by the spouses maintaining the environment. It can be the same thing when there is a caregiver involved. And later in life, there are times when somebody may have an increase in hoarding symptoms because of the loss of that support person, both because of the trauma of that event, but also because of the loss of that ongoing maintenance support to maintain the household. The other thing that can happen, we talked a little bit about acquiring. It can be, periods of intense excessive acquiring, or it could be long, slow buildup of possessions over time. So somebody who is 11 years old and has a parent might be, displaying some symptoms of hoarding disorder, but those symptoms again might be managed by the parent. And then as they progress throughout their lifetime, possessions might be acquired again at a faster rate than they are discarded, leading to, more of that point, as Millie talked about, when does clutter become a problem, happening later in life. Millie, did you want to talk about this?
Sure. So the impacts of hoarding on health and safety. We think a lot about health and safety because of the way we're interacting with clients daily as we're working with people. So a lot of times when we're thinking about health and safety, we kind of start with those harm reduction things. Are you going to fall? Are your activities of daily living impacted? Are you using space heaters and you have every newspaper from 1973 on stacked next to those things? We think a lot about fire, home maintenance. So if your pipe bursts, is there a way for somebody to get to that site and make repairs? Are you going to allow someone to come in and make those repairs? But there's also a host of other health and safety concerns. And one is just plain accessing in-home services. So getting home health workers to come in if there's been an injury or there's a need for some kind of therapeutic time. And just kind of a general loss of the feeling of safety. So folks who hoard or tend to have a lot of clutter often report feeling less safe than their neighbors, even in the same neighborhoods. And when squalor is involved and becomes severe, the health and safety of everybody in the neighborhood is impacted. So there could be vermin, there could be water-soaked support beams in a house. There's a lot of different things to think of when you're thinking about health and safety. And that fear of being discovered, just not reaching out for the superintendent to come take care of something. If there's mold in your bathroom, you're not going to risk someone coming into your home and discovering your mess. So you may be breathing unsafe air. There may be a lot of dust in your space that you're breathing. All of these things are kind of impacted in such a daily way that it becomes a new normal. And people will live with quite a lot of unsafe environment to keep their hoarding a secret.
So a few financial impacts as well. So especially when it comes to acquiring, it could be overspending associated with acquiring or debt associated with acquiring. I think it's really important to remember that hoarding does not discriminate based on income level. There is really no correlation with income level and hoarding disorder. So, some incomes can support quite a bit more purchasing acquiring than others, but all are really vulnerable to potential financial impacts. There could certainly be loss of home insurance, causing issues with the home's mortgage, late fees associated with inability to get or find mail. If belongings are disorganized, it's easy for a piece of mail to get lost, especially if that's an important bill, and late fees can pile up. And then certainly cost of cleaning services, maintenance or repairs, and pest extermination. One of the referrals that we see often is somebody who maybe has a lot of clutter in their home and it's preventing them from actually having that maintenance person come in and fix an issue that's been going on for a long time. Could be that the heat has gone out and, we tried to work around that solution or situation, but then because of that, the pipes burst. And so it's kind of a cascading, number of events that could happen in the home that are really causing more and more financial impact. So of course, we want to talk about what support is out there. So there are both clinical and non-clinical interventions that have a lot of support behind them in the research. So for clinical interventions, again, Millie and I are not clinicians, so we're not going to spend too much time talking about this, but individual counseling and cognitive behavioral therapy that's tailored to hoarding disorder, and then group counseling, again, tailored to hoarding disorder. Both are very effective. And then non-clinical interventions, which we'll talk a whole lot more about. So in-home decluttering support from a trained professional, evidence-based facilitated workshops and peer supports, and harm reduction strategies. And again, we'll go into more detail, but very conspicuously absent from this list are cleanouts. So that is, what you see on TV really. And often I think is still a go-to when providers are seeing a situation that they feel needs to be addressed immediately, especially in the case where, an eviction is imminent or there's perceived impacts on the health or safety of those around the individual. But cleanouts, there is a huge amount of evidence showing that these big, deep cleans that often are really traumatic for the individual are not effective at all. They're hugely costly and they lead to a very, very high rate of relapse. So it's really kind of pushing things down the line and only harming the individual who's in the situation and costing, tens of thousands of dollars at times, and again, not lasting very long.
So with all those great ways that we can get treatment, why don't we look for help? There's a lot of reasons that people don't seek out the help that is available. Sometimes it's just that fear. And sometimes that fear is more or less realistic. The fear of losing your housing, especially if you live in a rental situation, is at the top of the list for a reason. It's one of the main reasons that people hide their collecting, hoarding, and clutter issues. The other is shame or guilt over the situation. So for some people, Erin talked a little bit about insight earlier. For some folks, this doesn't seem to be as big of an issue. They're not particularly ashamed of their mess. They don't really see it as a problem. They don't have a ton of guilt. They feel like they're just fine and that people should butt out. For other people, just the idea that the neighbors might suspect that it's half as bad as it is debilitating. You'll see homes where the curtains haven't been opened in years because people are really afraid or shameful. And sometimes there's this feeling of culpability of like, I should be able to get out of this on my own. All I need to do is clean this up. It shouldn't be that hard. I haven't managed to make myself do it, but this kind of feeling of failure or guilt about being in the situation in the first place. That lack of insight and inability or unwillingness to make change, those are often folks that will get a call on the task force or at AgeWell of my neighbor who, and if we make contact with that person, they're like, no, I don't need anything, I'm fine. The other is fear of other types of repercussions. So that could be from something that actually happened, like losing social relationships, friendships, schisms with family members, anger from other family members who feel that the objects were chosen over the person. And they can also just be based on media portrayals. One of the first things people say to me when I make contact with them is, I'm not like those people on TV. Almost universally, I'm not like those people on TV. And I usually just say, well, I'm a little like those people on TV. That can help, but the media really shows, when it does show hoarding, it shows it typically in an unrealistic, like they've looked for the most extreme situation they can find. They're doing a huge clean out. There's trauma, there's arguments, it's kind of trauma-tainment. And seeing that on TV leads people to think that if they call for help, that's what's going to happen. Some team of people is going to come with shovels and take all their stuff, and like they'll be shouting and crying, and that's just the worst possible outcome that people can imagine. The other is just a lack of available resources and funding, and that's both real and perceived. So I think probably most of you who signed up for this today have an interest in this, and maybe some of you have gone looking for help either for yourself or for a loved one and just felt like there's nothing out there. There is definitely a lack of resources and funding to get somebody to where they need to be. You might be able to find funding for a dumpster, say, or like a short-term goal, but when you're looking at a situation that could take, a year of therapy and only a little bit of progress in moving things actually out of the home, there's just not funding to cover that. There are resources out there, and they're not necessarily easy to find. That's the other thing. If you do a search for hoarding intervention or hoarding help or clutter, you're likely to get marketed to by a host of clean out companies. And that can just really feel like all that's out there is exactly what you don't want. The next piece here thanks, is that the way we use the word hoarding as a culture is really stigmatizing. So this is our own United States Department of Justice website, and report hoarding and price gouging. So they're really talking about folks who were hoarding medical supplies when COVID started. They're not really talking about somebody who has like 30 copies of their favorite book in their house and can't discard their junk mail. But even just the feeling that this gives, report hoarding, is pretty terrifying if you're somebody who has issues with clutter, and is really, suggests that this is something that you're doing out of greed. Which is typically has nothing to do with why people have attachment to their things. So seeing these portrayals in the media, even if it's not specific to hoarding disorder or cleanouts or clutter, even just the use of that word can be so jarring. And folks will tend to self-identify as a pack rat or somebody who's got a lot of stuff or a collector. Most folks aren't comfortable using the word hoarding to describe their behavior, or hoarder to describe themselves. And that's a word that we stay away from for the most part. Although I just kind of like to take the power out of it by saying I'm the friendly face of hoarding in our community. So just being conscious when you see this word out in the world, how is it being used and who is it being used to describe and what is it suggesting, and pushing back, or even just on your own, not internalizing that can do a lot of good for folks that you haven't even met yet.
So we're going to launch into some tips for working with someone who struggles with hoarding or clutter. And these are really for any home visiting professionals. So I don't want anyone to take this advice and think this is only for people who are going into the homes to do decluttering. You may be going in, to provide another service, but this is something that's going on with the individual's life. So always remember that you're walking into someone's home. And I think, I can't overemphasize that enough. Generally you'll have a little bit of information based on your referral on what the situation might look like. We'll talk a little bit more about screening for that, but, be prepared, do whatever you need to do, give yourself a couple minutes beforehand to sort of get your game face on, because it's really, really important to leave judgment behind. And again, you're there to meet with the individual. That means making eye contact and not making any faces. There might be some odors in some situations. There might be narrow pathways. But again, your focus is on the individual. Don't assume the value of any possessions in the home. So we talked about that a little bit earlier, but it could be something that to you looks like a piece of trash, but has some real meaningful value for the individual. That could be sentimental value based on how the item was acquired. It could be value that maybe is in some ways misattributed, and that's something that the client or the individual wants to work on to really figure out how they might be able to discard of the volume of possessions. But then when it comes to that individual item, it's hard to work through that. So particularly if you are somebody who's providing some cleaning services, very important to not assume that anything is trash unless you've made that agreement with the client about that particular category of item. Identifying the individual's goals, those are the ones that matter. So often in these situations, there's a lot of external factors that are driving someone to make a change when they may feel that they're not ready to make that change. So it's most important, especially if somebody has, really actually either if somebody has self-referred or you've received a referral from someone else, what is the individual's hope for the use of their space, or how they want to either change or not change at this point in time. Often the goals might be, your assumption might be that the goal is to avoid this eviction that is being threatened, but the individual goals are actually just to be able to get the grandkids back in the home. And those are the ones that are going to lead to the most meaningful change, is focusing on those goals. Certainly be prepared to celebrate small victories. This can take a very long time. But small victories are really big victories in the hoarding game. So it's really important to recognize how much thought and effort might have gone into making some of those small decisions. Ask permission before handling any possessions. Again, that goes back to not knowing the value, but also, you are again in someone's home. And so you wouldn't necessarily walk into someone's home and be grabbing, anything that you want off the table. You want to ask permission for whatever you're doing. And then use objective and neutral language when coordinating services with providers and documenting client encounters. We've talked a lot about language here. There are some other strategies that can be used to develop a common language within an agency, and that can be really helpful, again, for communicating meaningfully amongst providers without imbuing some judgment. And then safety considerations. We thought it was really important to include this for anyone who's visiting the home of someone who might be struggling with clutter. But again, this doesn't just relate to somebody who's helping with decluttering. It could be, a nurse from Home Health and Hospice that's going in. It could be a clinician from Howard Center going in to provide other services. So you're going to pretty much use the same safety screening protocols that you would use for any of your new referrals if you're a home visiting professional, and hopefully you have some of those in place. So one of the strategies is using pre-screening questions to understand the level of precautions needed. So hopefully you already have some pre-screening questions that you might be asking of anyone that you're going to meet that you haven't met before. One that I like to ask is, when I come to visit, is there a place for me to sit down, or is it better if I stand? That is a question that can be asked without judgment, and really gives me a good idea based on the response of what the level of possessions in the home or what the area might look like before I even get there. And then, often I'm asking, are there any safety concerns that I should be aware of before I go into your home? Are there any, do you have any weapons? It's Vermont, so usually yes. And have you ever had any issues with pests? And again, I think this is really important to ask, because you do want to make sure that you're visiting safely. But have you ever had any issues with pests? Has a lot less sort of moral judgment meaning behind it than, say, do you have bed bugs in your home, or do you have fleas right now? We don't want to assume that we know what the situation is, but it's okay to ask these questions as well. So wear appropriate clothing and footwear. Again, not very different than what you'd use for any home visit. Closed-toed shoes. You want to avoid loose-fitting clothing for that purpose. It's really just to make sure that you're not wearing anything that might snag on some possessions and cause them to fall over, which could create a safety hazard for you, but then in particular for the individuals who's living there and may not be able to clear that pathway after you leave. Leave any excess belongings in the car. And then wear additional PPE as required. So outside of COVID, we know that there's additional PPE required for home visits right now anyway. But a couple things you might want to think about if you are somebody who's going in the home to do some decluttering work or some cleaning work. If a lot of items are going to be moved around, you might want to be wearing a mask like an N95 or something that will actually protect you from particles, latex or nitrile gloves. And, again, there's other things that you may want to consider wearing as well. If there's, a significant squalor, you might want to be wearing boots or, whatever else is indicated. The most important thing here, I think, is if you're going to be wearing any PPE above and beyond what you would wear on a typical home visit, always prepare the client for that ahead of time. So you don't want to show up in your full bedbug suit and your mask and respirator and boots if you've not given that person any warning about that. The other thing to think about is that, often it's a good idea to do a sort of introductory visit before you're going to get into the work that you're going to be doing. So there might be, additional level of protection that you're going to need if you're going to be doing decluttering, but you may not be doing that on your first visit. So try to tailor that to what is actually needed. And then when you're in the home, be aware of your surroundings. I mentioned, proximity to unstable piles. You do not want to create piles falling over. Mind narrow pathways. Understanding your path to an exit, that's, I think, one that is kind of probably ingrained in most of us as home visiting professionals, that if you're going into any home, you want to understand where your exits are at all time if there were ever a safety issue and you needed to leave. You need to have a little bit heightened awareness of this if you're working with somebody with excess clutter, because that pathway to the exit might not be as obvious and it might be very restricted. So just be mindful of that as you're in the home. And then, of course, any hazards related to the condition of the home, especially if home maintenance hasn't been able to happen for a while. So poor condition of flooring, certainly watch where you step. And again, this is not going to be in every situation, but something to be mindful of at all times. And then if you are assisting with decluttering or homemaking, just to be mindful of any hazards that might be in piles. So something that I think is maybe not as commonly thought of is if somebody is an insulin dependent diabetic and they are struggling with hoarding disorder or high levels of clutter, there might be sharps in those piles. And so if you're going to be the person who is assisting physically with the decluttering and homemaking, that might require puncture-proof gloves. It certainly would be paying close attention to what you're picking up and how you're moving in the space, only pulling from the top of the pile, again, to minimize risk of what you're grabbing, but also not knocking anything over. And then handling trash bags carefully, carrying them away from your body. And so we've got a few assessment tools here. We'll talk through a few of them. None of these are necessarily tools that you have to use. They're just tools that are out there that may be helpful depending on what type of practice you're in. One of them is the uniform inspection checklist. So this is actually a tool that is really helpful for harm reduction. So it goes through several different harm reduction targets here. So you see egresses, means of exit, unobstructed pathways, smoke detectors working, facilities working. So being able to access the toilet, the stove, oven, dryer. So these are some things that, again, when you're working with somebody, if they, or even thinking about yourself, if you have a lot of clutter in your home, this is a great tool to even do a self-assessment to see, okay, is my safety, am I okay with safety on these different targets that are outlined here? And what are the small things that I might be able to do without thinking about this overwhelming project that I might have ahead of me, just to make sure that I'm a little bit safer in the home. And so often, if we're working with somebody who has excess clutter, we're going to be talking about these things before we talk about, the whole project and whether somebody is wanting or willing to tackle that at this time. There are still some interventions that can help improve safety.
And just to jump in on the peer support note, these are widely used in peer support circles. So a lot of times when someone's in a group with other folks who have clutter issues for whatever reason and whatever type, the first thing that happens in a peer support circle is also harm reduction. So these may feel a little bit clinical to some folks, but just know, like, in general circles of general conversation, we're also using the hoarding image rating scale to describe how full our room is. We're also, letting someone know that the first thing they should do is make sure that they have safe egress. So it's not only for home visitors that these assessment tools can be really useful. And a lot of them are incorporated into the peer supportive environment hoarding workshop that we'll talk about in a little bit.
So this is familiar. I put this slide up earlier. Just again, wanted to talk about how this tool can be really helpful in, again, establishing that common language that Millie's talking about. So communicating with peers, communicating with professionals, especially if somebody is embarking on a decluttering effort, it might be helpful to use this scale to sort of assess where things are at right now. But one of the ways that we use this tool most frequently is, again, in assessing insight. So, in the past, I might have met with someone and said, here's this tool. Again, in the full tool, there's multiple different versions of rooms. So there's a kitchen and living room, bedroom and bathroom. And so we'll take a look at whatever room we're talking about and both independently rate how we think that room rates on that scale, and then sort of compare our answers. So if I put down a 6 and the person I'm working with puts down a 6, I know then that we're on the same page about how we see the room. Doesn't mean that we're on the same page about how that's impacting their life or whether there's, desire to change at that point, but I at least know that we're both seeing sort of the same level of clutter. If I put down a 6 and someone puts down a 2, then that's going to lead to a whole different conversation and, more questions about how they're using the space and, how is it that they came to that rating. So this is one of the tools that is commonly used as well. It's called the ADLH, or Activities of Daily Living Hoarding Assessment Scale. This is just one of many, many rating scales. We've put a couple links in this presentation, which I know will be sent out to various assessment tools, but this is one that really just goes through the basic activities of daily living and how easily they can be done or not done based on the level of clutter in that room. Another one is the hoarding rating scale. This is just a 5-question assessment, so it's a nice short one that can be integrated if it's helpful in a particular situation. But it helps to assess the individual's level of insight, again, about the situation, and also assesses how much they feel, to what extent they feel that their activities of daily living are impacted by the clutter. Millie, I'll turn it back to you.
On to Buried in Treasures. So the Buried in Treasures workshop is near and dear to my heart, and I actually have Erin to thank for bringing it to my attention in the first place. I'd heard of the book before, but I had not heard about the workshop. Buried in Treasures, the book, is kind of a self-helpy type workbook that actually kind of brings you through a bunch of behavioral exercises that can help you identify your own reasons for saving or acquiring, what kind of barriers you're up against, and gives you some really concrete tools for working on those things. The Buried in Treasures workshop is a 16-week facilitated peer environment. So it's not a support group per se, but it's a lot different to work through this book together in a group and do homework and be accountable to other folks. It's an evidence-based workshop that was developed by mental health workers who also had their own clutter issues and based on this book. So it's kind of a collaboration between the folks who study hoarding and the folks with lived experience, kind of sharing what works in actual practice to get people to have a little less clutter, if nothing more. So folks learn about hoarding disorder, clutter, acquiring. They learn about emotional triggers. They learn about, that kind of feeling that an object has feelings. A lot of folks who hoard tend to anthropomorphize things. They want to rescue the broken chair. They want to protect the teddy bear that's been in the family for generations. But really its main purpose is to gain skills so that no matter what the reason you're keeping things is, you're able to help pull yourself out of that. So there's a lot in there that's useful for folks who have squalor issues, but not hoarding, for folks who maybe don't have as firm an attachment to things as would be diagnosable as hoarding disorder, but still live in an environment that's so cluttered that it's a safety risk to them. So it really is really useful for a broad spectrum of people who have clutter issues. And by the end of those 16 weeks, folks are usually pretty bonded. And one of the really great pieces of this is that it has a built-in after group setup. So folks who took the class together can go on to be in a support group together that they run themselves. I still meet with the folks that I took the class with when I took it as a participant. And I know some folks who've taken the classes are still in contact with each other and really do continue to do the work, sometimes for literal years after they've taken the class. I'm really proud to be able to help keep that going in our community, and really grateful that AgeWell values this class and lends my time out to run it.
We love this class very much. In particular, again, as Millie said, because it's evidence-based. It's actually in terms of reducing the level of clutter in the home. It's on par with group cognitive behavioral therapy that's offered by a licensed clinician. And this workshop is designed to be offered not by a licensed clinician. One of our specialized care and service coordinators, Derek Souza, along with an intern that we have right now, Kiara Dunphy, they're running this workshop right now. So it's in progress. I don't have a date for the next one, but we're hoping to continue this long into the future. So we'll certainly keep everyone posted. And so we wanted to just wrap up here talking about how your agency, and your agency meaning any agency, I think our own agency included, how can we improve the services we provide to individuals with hoarding or clutter? So developing a common language to facilitate meaningful conversations, improve care coordination, and reduce stigma. Identifying common assessment tools and interventions. Again, we kind of breezed through a few of them here, but there are so many. And we've put some additional resources in here at the end as well. Would really encourage your teams to work together to see, is there a common assessment tool or type of intervention that you feel comfortable either using or referring your clients to. Ensure adequate training for home visiting professionals to improve person-centered care and safety. And then understanding the resources available in your community. Get connected to your local hoarding task force. And I already saw a couple of questions come into the Q&A about local task force. And so we'll put some information up about that as well. And then, of course, we could not go through this whole presentation without talking about how COVID-19 has impacted many individuals with hoarding disorder or different levels of clutter. And I think this is important to talk about now as things start to reopen a bit with vaccinations. I know that there are many home visiting professionals who may have been doing work remotely for a long time and are now just getting back into the homes. And we are sort of expecting that we may see some levels of clutter that are worse than they were pre-pandemic. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We've all been living through a pretty traumatic situation here over the last year. And for those with pre-existing mental health conditions, there's a lot of research about, the risk of relapse, missed medications for comorbid conditions, stress, poor self-care, and suicidality. Increased stress can certainly also reduce the tolerance for the stress associated with discarding and reducing acquiring. So these are often very emotionally difficult things to go through. So starting the process of discarding for someone who does have hoarding disorder is very stressful. And a lot of what we talk about in the Buried in Treasures work is really coping with that stress and pushing through it to complete the task and really reach that individual's goals. But again, in a situation where there's a lot of increased environmental stress, the tolerance for that can be lower. Certainly symptoms from other comorbid conditions may also increase. And one thing that has been a concern is that there are many fewer professionals, or have been over the last year, going into the homes. And so whereas significant increases in clutter might have been caught by somebody and hopefully referred to a helpful resource to at least talk to that individual about whether they want to be seeking additional assistance at this point, that may not have happened as frequently in the past year. So these may be the first times that someone's really going into the home after a long period of time. Certainly there's been reduced access to cleaning services. They're in very high demand right now for commercial cleaning services, but also just staffing shortages that are driven by a number of factors, but COVID has certainly impacted those. So even getting those maintenance cleaning services that many people may receive has been much more difficult. And then some people who hoard may feel that their behaviors are validated when food and resources scarce. Millie, is this one that you wanted to talk about at all?
Yeah, so this is a thing, and it has a little to do with the news reports that we saw early in COVID as well, being like, people are hoarding toilet paper. It wasn't typically the people with hoarding disorder who were hoarding the toilet paper. It was panic buying, which is a different thing entirely. But, a lot of folks who keep things just in case, and there's a lot of that in clutter and hoarding, really can feel like vindicated. Well, I didn't have to go to the store at the really bad surge in my community because I have all these things in my home already. I can live out of this pantry cupboard for the next 6 weeks without having to go and put myself in danger. So for folks where some of their hoarding behaviors are based on fear of scarcity or lack, really found that that sort of behavior proved itself a useful coping tool. So it can be a little hard to walk that back later when you're trying to work on your own issues of like, okay, I know I don't need all this stuff, but it really did come in handy when there was a COVID surge.
So we're going to wrap up, and no need to jot this down. We'll make sure that all the resources get sent out. But wanted to put our helpline number right at the top there. So again, we've talked a little bit about some supports that we can provide through specialized care and service coordination, registration for the Buried in Treasures workshop. Again, right now, unfortunately, that one is ongoing and full, but we'll keep everyone posted about next date. Certainly caregiver support, if somebody is providing significant care to somebody who is struggling with hoarding or clutter and needs some support for themselves. Millie is our caregiver support specialist, so she's well equipped to provide support there. And then general information through our helpline, which is always available. The helpline is not just providing referrals to our services, but helping to connect resources available in the community. So I listed there a contact for the Chittenden County Hoarding Task Force, which is currently virtual, as everything is, but does meet monthly. There is also an Addison County Hoarding Task Force, and I've listed a contact there. The Burlington Housing Authority Housing Retention Team is a great support for the task force and for individuals who are living in Burlington housing. And then I've listed one of our colleagues, David O'Leary's contact information here. He is a mental health clinician who has a lot of experience working with individuals with hoarding disorder. Although unfortunately, I believe he is he's full right now, but he certainly can be a source of information and support, and gave us the okay to list him anyway. And then on the next page, so those were all local resources. The next page is really more educational resources outside of our area. So link to the Buried in Treasures book there. There are several tools, as I mentioned, listed in the Buried in Treasures workshop workbook. And then I had to list the Mass Housing Hoarding Resources. Massachusetts Housing Authority has a huge wealth of resources related to hoarding. And just, I think their website is a great source for a lot of that information. And then also the website of Mutual Support, who are the individuals who put together the facilitator's guide for the Buried Treasures workshop. And I think that'll do it. Millie, was there something you wanted to add there?
I'm just skimming the questions now while you kind of wrap up the resources. And I recognize that you all can't see each other's questions. So there's quite a few similar questions in here. We'll try to smush them together as we go. But I just wanted to start really quickly. We have some questions both about Buried Treasures and the task force. So the Buried Treasures workshop, we do not limit to people only over 60. So no, you don't need to be 60 plus to join that workshop. I took it in my 40s. And we're happy to open that resource up to the whole entire community. And as for fees, we do ask that people put up the cost of the materials of the book that they keep. But we definitely have grant money available for scholarships when that's needed. It's we would never want that to be a barrier to people joining the class.
There's one here that I think might be good for you to tackle. So how can one best support a friend who may have hoarding disorder when there are young children in the home and the living conditions of the house are unsafe? For example, rooms completely filled with stuff, narrowed walkways, unclean, etc. If they weren't my friend, I would consider reporting them to Child Protective Services.
So that's a great question and a really touchy question. And one of those big fears that folks have, is not just about the stigma of hoarding, but the consequence of hoarding. And so I have young children. So this is a question that really kind of hits home for me and also comes up quite a lot in peer circles. So there's a couple things at play here. The first is CPS is not the boogeyman. When they come to help a family, they're not looking to come in and yank children out of people's homes. So if you feel that the child's health is at risk, if the situation is dangerous, any situation that I would call CPS for a stranger, I feel like I should call CPS for a friend, maybe even more so. So if the worry is that other things haven't worked and there's genuine safety concerns that are immediate, call them and they will help that family get connected to resources, and they will typically work with that family. I know that's a scary answer for folks who have clutter issues to hear, and that can depend on a lot of other factors, a lot of social things at play, depending where you live, what other things may have happened in your family history to make that a less safe situation. So I would say use your judgment, just like you would in any situation where you would call an authority. But there are definitely ways to get help without going to that length. Encouraging your friend to educate themselves about the different resources that are available, offering to watch the kids so that the people who live in the house can work on cleaning things out, getting them connected with a family therapist. There's another similar question in the chat that I noticed about family relationships, and hoarding tears families apart. Being raised in a hoarding household can be very traumatic. There can be a lot of anger. One of the resources that families of people who hoard sometimes go to are like the Children of Hoarders group. And there's a lot of anger in that space, and it is absolutely justified anger. So there are a lot of ways that hoarding can be impacting a family, or in this specific question, your friend's children, besides just their actual physical safety in the moment. So if you can get them to accept some kind of family therapy, that's a great start and is almost more important than what the physical space looks like at this moment. I hope that that's a helpful answer to you, and not terrifying to those of you out there who have cluttered homes and have kids. Trust me, I know that feeling. My kids are school age right now, and it was really hard to be raising them when they were small in an unsafe environment, and it made me feel like a terrible, terrible person.
Thanks, Millie. And I hope that through this presentation, I hope we've made clear that, our intent really is to help individuals meet their goals and preserve housing. And really that's what we hope for, the providers in our community as well, because it does, I think, take a lot of supports to support someone who has, a big challenge with clutter. So, again, we're hoping to be working with people and not against them in all of those spaces. I saw another question come in that I think is definitely worth us addressing, since this is a Howard Center presentation. How did you become so knowledgeable on this topic? Any advice for a clinician who would like to focus their work more in this area? My program works with a lot of clients who struggle with clutter, hoarding, and squalor, and I'm hoping to become more versed in this area. Are there more trainings out there that clinicians can take to increase their knowledge on clutter and hoarding? I'm sure we both have a lot to say about this. I think there are so many resources. So I think Millie and I have both been to a number of trainings, some much more intensive than others. And that's led to our experience at this point. And of course, Millie's own experience, personal experience, and with peer support. But I would really encourage, I know Dave O'Leary, he's probably on this call, would be very happy to take a call from a clinician who was interested in learning more about this and specializing more in this area. So I'm going to just put his name out there as a resource, but I would also say we're really happy to provide more information about trainings as well. Having been to a number of them, there are some really, really, really good trainings out there. Many of them are geared towards actually doing the decluttering work in the home. But if you are a clinician looking for more experience and deeper understanding of hoarding disorder, I would not shy away from those, even if that's not your intended practice, because those trainings do tend to have a lot of really high quality information about different approaches to use that can be adapted to, say, motivational interviewing styles or different levels of practice, whether it's happening in the home or outside of the home in a clinic setting. All right, let's see here. Millie, feel free to shout out any questions that you're seeing here.
Oh my gosh, we got a whole bunch more questions all at once. There's some more task force related questions in here. The task force that we're most involved in is the Chittenden County Hoarding Task Force. It's not a governing body. I'm going to try to hit a bunch of these different questions at once here. It's not an agency. It has no power to do a particular thing. It's not an entity that you can engage the services of for an intervention or a clean out. It's more just an organization of various community stakeholders. So it has folks from various housing entities. It has the Humane Society. It has the fire department. It has housing inspectors. It has folks from AgeWell. It has, just kind of a confederation of professionals who encounter clutter issues in their field work, meeting together to see how they can best educate the community and support individuals who are having various issues. So it is not a closed group necessarily. We do meet monthly, but we do ask that people go through Leah Curran and let us know their reason for wanting to join the group for a meeting if they have something that they wanted to share with us. We always want to be conscious that we're not in charge of anybody, and we're not a legal group. So, if you're a landlord who wants to know how many boxes to tick off before you go for eviction, the task force is not the place to ask that question. And other community organizations like health inspectors, the fire department, and the Department of Health, a lot of times when they come to the group, they're looking for ways to support the individual family. So rarely do we encounter a professional who's like, what do I do about these awful hoarders? It's folks who are coming to say, you know, I have a family that's really challenged. Their housing is in jeopardy. What can we do to get them to a safe place? So it's really a collaboration of community stakeholders.
Millie, there was one question here that was directed to you specifically. What's been most helpful for you? Like if you had to say your top 2 supports.
Peer support, top 1. Peer support is where it's at. So, and that also comes to the, like, how do we get so knowledgeable on this? I belong to an online forum, and I'm happy to share it for those of you who are yourselves experiencing clutter. It's a public forum. It's called Stepping Out of Squalor, which is, you know, really spicy name that's really attractive to people who are in crisis. But it really doesn't sugarcoat. And so I kind of found it on my own a few years ago and joined and just started talking to people who are living in conditions that are not great, whether they're living in squalor or whether they were hoarding or whether they were facing eviction or whether they're homeowners and were not in any danger. Just folks supporting other folks and understanding what a great thing. If someone says, I cleaned off my nightstand, we celebrate that like the Nobel Peace Prize. Peer support is amazing, whether it's formal or informal, facilitated or not. It's the best thing to get people to be able to make change comfortably and at a speed they can handle. One caveat to that, and I know there's some folks quite a few folks in the chat asking questions about animal hoarding. Peer support is not a great environment for folks with animal hoarding issues. I don't know if there are animal hoarding forums somewhere where folks can support each other. But if you think on the surface that somebody who has attachment issues to objects and collects those objects and treats them as though they have thoughts and feelings, coming up against somebody who maybe has a living creature with thoughts and feelings that isn't getting cared for very well, it's very oil and water. The few folks that have come into peer environments that I've been in who have animal hoarding issues do not find a supportive environment. People straight up freak out at them. There's no way to sugarcoat that. So the Humane Society is an amazing resource for folks who have an animal hoarding issue. Again, not just like I say with CPS, their goal is not to come in and punish people. Their goal is to make a sustainable, healthy situation for those animals. And if they can figure out how to do that for somebody, they try. So, you know, that's not a promise that they won't remove animals from a home. They absolutely do that as well. But, you know, their main goal is to make sure that those animals are safely cared for. And if they can find a way to make that happen for folks maybe who just got overwhelmed with caring for the animals and are not truly animal hoarders, but maybe just have too many animals. I don't know how to make that distinction. Again, we're not clinicians. They're definitely the resource for that. And they're really active in hoarding circles as well, making sure that they're using best practices.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly, Millie, in the Humane Society being a great resource. I also just want to add the reason that we didn't talk about animal hoarding in our presentation is that I think there's a lot more research coming out recently about that being really, really distinct from hoarding disorder as we talked about it today, that there are a lot of other driving factors and different, you know, intervention approaches and different supports available. Definitely worthy of its own entire presentation that neither Millie or I are probably qualified to provide, but there are some distinctions there, even though they're often grouped together, and I think that's really important to recognize too. Are there different approach strategies for folks who have a difficult time getting rid of possessions out of fear of accidentally throwing out things of value? Perhaps related to OCD, rather than those with high levels of acquiring objects. So I would say yes. I'm sure Millie's got things to contribute as well. I think that this is, if you are somebody who is there to provide support specifically around the hoarding issues, or if you are looking for change in an environment because you're coming from the perspective of housing or health and safety, it is really important to understand whether there is active excessive acquiring going on or just difficulty with reducing belongings in the home. I have earlier in my career definitely made the mistake of tunnel vision, only looking at discarding and not having any conversations with the individual about whether items were still coming into the home. And I was, I think, as frustrated as the person I was working with, that there wasn't a lot of change that we were seeing because the things that we were moving were quickly being replaced. And so there are completely different approaches because those are two different behaviors in terms of reducing acquiring and discarding. So the Buried in Treasures workshop is great in that it has several whole sort of modules focused on reducing acquiring. There are different thought exercises that someone can go through to really think through the acquiring before it takes place, and then some exercises as well. There's a practice non-acquiring shopping trip and things like that. And then similarly, there are a lot of different techniques around reducing, around discarding and understanding, the value of those items and what the goal is overall. So short answer, yes, definitely different approaches. Let's see here. I do see a couple of questions asking about supporting loved ones who are in other states, who maybe the person who's on the call is residing in Vermont, but they're supporting somebody who they think may have hoarding disorder who's living in another state. One thing I'll say is that in general, the area agencies on aging, although they may be called something slightly different in every state, some form of them is available in every state. And typically you can go online and find the area agency on aging that's in your area. In some places they're called aging service access points. In some they're aging disability resource centers. So a few keywords to search. If you are not sure, you can call our helpline and we can help you identify where the area agency on aging is in another state. But that's a great place to start, as they generally have some form of helpline that collects resources in the area.
Erin, we should add the elder care locator to our resource list, because you can just plug in your
you.
zip code and boom, there's your area agency on aging or council on aging or whatever they're called, wherever they are. I do see a lot of questions about how to get people to make change in various ways. And that's a whole webinar by itself. But one thing I'll say is that forced change doesn't stick, and that the insight people gain into why they do things by going through something like the Buried in Treasures class, or even just the book itself, can help people motivate to do a little thing here or there. And a big problem that folks who have clutter issues will find is that because success looks so different to us than to the people on the outside, we often feel discouraged from making change, because when we do make a change, it's never enough change and it's never fast enough for whatever that outside push is. So, that little piece of celebrate small successes is the best way to help somebody stay on the path of working on their mess, on their clutter, on their property, whatever it is that you're working with. But to try to get them started, that's really going to be very individual from person to person.
Millie, I'm seeing that we have time for one more question. Do you want to do the pick?
Oh gosh, there's so many good questions in here. I'm so sorry we can't answer all of these. I'm going to stay away from legal advice. There's some questions about Well, actually, maybe we shouldn't stay away from legal advice on this. Just so folks know, maybe if you are a mandated reporter in some aspect of your work, or worry that all hoarding behavior is categorized as self-neglect, it definitely isn't. So getting people connected to services is often not as simple as identifying that they have a clutter issue and turning them in.
Oh, here we go. So
yeah, Erin, can you see?
I'm gonna unshare my screen here, and I'm just gonna wrap up with summarizing several questions that I saw in here about the sort of causes of hoarding disorder. And I saw some comments in the question and answer section as well. So we didn't really go into that, but there are several sort of factors that might make someone more likely to have hoarding symptoms. There is certainly evidence that there's a genetic component, although that's certainly not the whole picture. It can be related to, in some cases, a traumatic event or, again, environment from childhood. It can be related to a loss. I mean, we talked a little bit about losses that happen later in life, that there might be some underlying behaviors and that exacerbates them. So while I won't have time to go into full detail about that, those are some of the underlying causes in the research. And I think we'll hand it back over here to Denise, but thank you everyone for your questions.
Erin and Millie, thank you so very much. This was really wonderful, and so glad you were here to help shine a light on this really important topic. And you did so in such a really respectful way. So thank you for that. Thanks to our viewers for coming today, maybe from outside on a beautiful day. And we'd be really grateful if you could take a few minutes. We'll send you an email tomorrow from Zoom to complete the feedback form. That really helps us in our planning for the fall and beyond. And then we will have the recording from today and Erin and Millie's wonderful slide deck on our website within a day or two. So just check that, howardcenter.org, and go to the Community Education Series pages. And then we'll be back in the fall with our fall series. If we offer any pop-ups between now and then, we'll let you know through email, social media, and through Front Porch Forum. And then just recognize that we are here. We have many programs and resources at Howard Center. Our main number is 802-488-6000. And you can also visit us online at howardcenter.org. So thanks again. Thank you, Erin and Millie. Really, really appreciate it. And have a great rest of the day and week. Bye-bye.